I came home from the hospital on a Tuesday morning in April. The cab driver helped me with the door, not because I asked him to, but because he was the kind of man who notices when someone needs help and acts on it without making a production of it. I thanked him. I stood on the sidewalk in front of my house, the one I built in 1987, with my own hands, and the help of 2 friends who owed me favors, and a wife who handed me tools and kept me fed, and told me when the window frames were not level, which they were, twice. Ruth's house, my house. I stood on the sidewalk with a plastic bag containing my personal effects from the hospital, wallet, phone, the reading glasses I had broken the second day and repaired with electrical tape, a get-well card from my granddaughter Emma that she had illustrated herself with a drawing of what appeared to be either me in a hospital bed or a man being attacked by a very large pillow. And I looked at my house. There was a moving truck in the driveway, not my truck, a professional moving company's truck, and there were 2 men I did not recognize carrying a sofa through my front door, a sofa I had never seen before. I stood on the sidewalk for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt considerably longer. Then I walked up the front path. A woman came out of the house behind the men with the sofa. 30s, dark hair. She was directing them. Left. A little more. Watch the doorframe. With the efficient attention of someone managing a complex operation. She saw me. She said, "Oh, hi. Are you? Can I help you?" I said, "I think there may be some confusion." She said, "I'm sorry?" I said, "This is my house." She looked at me, at the hospital wristband still on my left wrist, at the plastic bag, at the cab pulling away from the curb. She said, carefully, "Sir, this house was sold 3 weeks ago. We close the deal officially tomorrow. We're just doing a preliminary move-in." I said, "I didn't sell this house." She said, What?" I said, "My name is Arthur Mason. I built this house in 1987. I have lived in it for 37 years, and I did not sell it." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I think we need to make some phone calls. My name is Arthur Mason. I am 74 years old. I am a retired carpenter, and I came home from the hospital to find strangers moving into the house I built with my late wife Ruth. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the house first, because the house is not just a house. It is not, in the way that some people relate to property, an investment, or an asset, or a number on a piece of paper. It is 37 years of my marriage. I started building it in the spring of 1987. I was 37 years old. Ruth was 35. We had been renting a small house on the other side of town for 9 years, and we had been saving, the way young people save when they have a specific dream, and not much else, for longer than that. I am a carpenter. I have been a carpenter since I was 19 years old, when my father took me on with his crew, and I discovered that working with wood was not something I did because it was available, but something I was built for. The specific satisfaction of making something that was not there before, of understanding the structure of things, of knowing, when you are done, exactly what you made and why it will hold. I designed the house on the back of a blueprint paper I borrowed from a commercial job. Ruth had opinions, specific and useful ones, about every room. She wanted the kitchen facing east for the morning light. She wanted a porch with enough room for 2 chairs and a small table, because she believed that porches were where real conversations happened. She wanted the master bedroom to have a window seat, because she read every night before sleeping, and she wanted somewhere to sit with a book and the night garden visible through the glass. I built everything she asked for. The kitchen faces east. The porch has the chairs and the table. A small pine table I made myself, which I have refinished 3 times over 37 years, and which still holds its level. The window seat in the bedroom has her books still on it. I have not been able to move them. Ruth died in 2019 of a stroke. She was 67, We had been married 41 years. She died in the window seat room, which I was initially afraid would make the room impossible for me to be in. But it has not worked that way. I sleep in that room still. I sit in her window seat sometimes on Sunday mornings with my coffee, and I look at the night garden, which is, in the morning garden, but she always called it the night garden because that was when she saw it most. My son Michael has been asking me, for 3 years, what my plan is. Not unkindly, at first. He would come over for Sunday dinner, which I cook, which surprises people, though I am not sure why a man who worked with his hands for 50 years would not also know how to cook. And he would look at the house with the specific evaluating attention of a man who has been thinking about something and has not yet decided whether to say it. He would say things like, "Dad, this place is a lot for one person." I would say, "I'm one person who built it. I know how much it is." He would say, "You know what I mean." I said, "I do, and I appreciate the concern, but I'm fine, Michael." He said, "You're 74. I said, "I know my age." He said, "Emily and I have talked about." I said, "Michael, I am fine. The house is fine. Let's eat." He was under financial pressure. I knew this. His business. He runs a landscaping company, which has always been somewhat seasonal, and which had been hit hard by 2 difficult summers and a winter that was harder than projected, had been struggling for 2 years. He had borrowed money, not from me. I did not have the kind of money that would have made a difference. But he had lines of credit that were straining. The house was worth, by current market estimates, somewhere between $350,000 and $400,000. I knew Michael had looked this up. I knew because he mentioned it once, casually, in the way that people mention things they have been thinking about a great deal and are testing the temperature of the room for. I did not respond to the mention. I made him another cup of coffee. I thought about the east-facing kitchen and the porch with the pine table and the window seat with Ruth's books, and I thought, this is my home, and I am not done in it. Before I tell you about the heart attack, I need to tell you about Emma Grace Mason, 11 years old, Michael and Emily's daughter, my granddaughter. She has Ruth's stubbornness, which skipped a generation in Michael and surfaced with full force in Emma. She has my hands, wide palms, good fingers, which she uses with the same instinct I have always had, the instinct toward making things. She started coming to my workshop at 7. The workshop is in the garage, a proper workshop, built the same year as the house, with the workbenches I made myself, and the tool racks organized the way Ruth said only I could organize them, which meant perfectly clearly to me and completely mysteriously to everyone else. Emma walked in one Saturday when she was 7, stood in the middle of the workshop, looked at everything, and said, "Grandpa, can I make something?" I said, "What do you want to make?" She said, "A box. For my things." I said, "What kind of things?" She thought about it. Then she said, "The kind of things that need a box." I showed her how to measure, how to mark, how to use the hand saw with my hands over hers, how to sand with the grain, which is something people get wrong constantly and which matters more than they think. We made the box over 3 Saturdays. It was not perfect. The lid sat slightly crooked. One corner was not quite flush. She looked at it when we finished. She said, "Grandpa, it's a little crooked." I said, "Yes." She said, "Is that bad?" I said, "It means you made it. A machine makes things straight. A person makes things with character." She considered this. She said, "I like it." She has been in the workshop most Saturdays since. 4 years of Saturdays. She has made a box, 2 birdhouses, a small bookshelf for her room, a picture frame that she gave her mother for Christmas, and a rocking horse that was too ambitious for an 8-year-old, but that we completed anyway, in January, over 4 cold Saturdays, and which she considers her masterpiece. The rocking horse is in her room. She sends me photographs of it sometimes, when I least expect it. Just a picture, no caption, I understand. The Saturday before the heart attack, she came to the workshop as usual. We were working on a simple garden bench. Her idea, for her mother's birthday. She said, while we were sanding, "Grandpa, are you going to live here forever?" I said, "What makes you ask that?" She said, "Dad says the house is too big for you." I said, "The house is exactly the size I built it." She said, "That's not what he means." I said, "I know what he means." She said, "Are you going to move?" I said, "No." She said, "Good." She went back to sanding. She said, after a moment, "Who would use the workshop?" I said, "Well, you would. Every Saturday." She said, "Oh." She seemed satisfied with this. We finished the sanding. She ran her hand across the wood with the specific attention of someone who has learned to feel for imperfections rather than just look for them. She said, "Smooth." I said, "Smooth." She said, "Can we do the staining next Saturday?" I said, "Next Saturday." Next Saturday, I was in the hospital. It happened on a Wednesday. I had been in the workshop since morning. I often spend Wednesday mornings there, working on whatever project is current, or simply maintaining the tools, which need regular attention, and which I find the maintenance of genuinely pleasant. Around 11, I felt something in my chest. Not the dramatic television version, not a sudden collapse. Something more like pressure, the specific pressure of something that should not be there. I sat down on the workshop stool. I thought about Ruth, who had been a nurse for 12 years before we had Michael. She had told me once, in the way she told me things she thought I needed to know and would probably ignore, that the thing most men did wrong with cardiac events was talk themselves out of them. She said, "Arthur, if you ever feel something in your chest that doesn't belong there, you call 911 immediately. You do not wait. You do not decide you're fine. You call." I called. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes, which I noted with the professional appreciation of someone who values precision. I was, as it turned out, having a heart attack. The doctors described it as a significant cardiac event. There was blockage. There was surgery, a procedure that I was unconscious for, and which I am therefore unable to describe from experience, but which the surgeon described afterward with the calm specificity of someone who does this regularly and has not lost the ability to make you feel it was in capable hands. I was in the hospital for 18 days. Michael came the first day. He sat beside my bed in the cardiac unit, and he held my hand, which he had not done since he was approximately 8 years old, and he looked genuinely frightened in the way that I found both moving and slightly alarming, because Michael does not frighten easily. He said, "Dad, you have to start thinking about things." I said, "I'm thinking about a great many things right now." He said, "About the future, about what happens when..." I said, "Michael, I just had surgery." He said, I know, I'm sorry, I said, "Let me get through the week, then we'll talk." He came back twice more in the 18 days. Emma came 4 times. She was not supposed to. The cardiac unit had visiting restrictions, but she came with Michael, and she stood in the doorway of my room with a card she had made that said, "Get well, Grandpa," in letters she had cut from magazine pages and glued to construction paper, decorated with what I believe were intended to be hammers and saws, which I found appropriate, and which I put on the windowsill immediately. She said, from the doorway, "Grandpa, are you going to be okay?" I said, "I am going to be fine, Emma." She said, "Promise?" I said, "I promise." She said, "You can't break a promise." I said, "I know the rules." She said, "The workshop is waiting." I said, "Tell it I'll be there soon." She nodded with the seriousness of someone who intends to relay this message. On the 14th day, the doctor sat with me and went through the discharge plan, medications, dietary changes, activity restrictions for the first month, a cardiac rehabilitation program. I said, I'm going home. He said, we'd like to keep you a few more days for observation. I said, I know. I'm not arguing. I'm stating my intention. He said, you live alone? I said, yes. He said, we'll want to make sure there's a plan. I said, I have a plan. I go home. I follow the discharge instructions. I attend cardiac rehab. I do not lift anything over 10 pounds for 6 weeks, which is going to be a significant personal challenge. He almost smiled. He said, we'll discharge you Tuesday. I said, Tuesday. Michael called that evening. I told him Tuesday. He said, Dad, Emily and I have been talking about whether going back to the house is the right choice. I said, it's not a choice. It's where I live. He said, I know, but maybe, temporarily, you could come stay with us while you recover. I said, I'll be fine at home. He said, Dad? I said, Michael, Tuesday. I'll be home Tuesday. He said, okay. He said it in the tone of a man who has said, okay, and means something else. I should have heard that more clearly than I did. The cab driver's name was George. He was 60-something and quiet in the comfortable way of someone who has driven a great many people, a great many places, and has made peace with the varied nature of those journeys. He helped me with the door of the cab without being asked. I stood on the sidewalk in front of my house. The moving truck, the 2 men with the sofa, the woman who did not know she was moving into someone else's home. Her name, as I learned in the following minutes, was Carol Patterson. She was 34. She had 2 children, ages 6 and 8. She was a second-grade teacher. She had saved for 8 years to buy a house. She had believed, completely and in good faith, that she was purchasing a properly listed property from a seller who had the legal authority to sell it. She had not known about me. She had not known about the hospital. She had not known that the man whose name was on the deed had not signed the transfer documents. None of what followed was her fault. I want to say that clearly, because it is true, and because the story of what happened is not her story. She was caught in something that had nothing to do with her, and she handled it, throughout, with a decency that I found genuinely admirable. When I told her I was Arthur Mason and that I had not sold my house, she did not argue with me. She went very still for a moment. Then she said, I need to call my realtor. I said, I need to call my lawyer. She said, I'm sorry. If what you're saying is true, I'm very sorry. I said, I believe you. I sat on the porch, on the chair beside the pine table I had made, and refinished 3 times in 37 years, and I called Patricia Holt. Patricia had handled my legal affairs for 11 years. She was 63, careful and direct in the specific way of lawyers who have seen enough to know that directness is almost always more useful than hedging. She answered on the 2nd ring. I said, Patricia, someone sold my house while I was in the hospital. I'm sitting on the porch right now, watching a woman move furniture into my living room. A pause. She said, Arthur, are you serious? I said, I just had heart surgery. I don't have the energy for jokes. She said, who handled the sale? I said, I don't know yet. I didn't authorize it. She said, did you give Michael power of attorney? I said, no. Another pause. She said, don't go inside. Don't speak to the buyers again without me present. I'll be there in 45 minutes. I said, Patricia. She said, yes. I said, the woman moving in is innocent. She didn't know. She said, I know. We'll handle this carefully. She was there in 40 minutes. She reviewed the paperwork that Carol Patterson's realtor faxed over. There was a notary on the corner 3 blocks away who was willing to do an emergency transmission, while I sat on the porch and Carol sat inside, and we each waited for someone to tell us what was true. Patricia came to the porch. She sat in Ruth's chair. She said, Arthur, the deed transfer was filed 3 weeks ago. It lists Michael as the authorized seller under an emergency powers provision. I said, I never signed an emergency power of attorney. She said, I know you didn't. I have your file. There is no such document. She said, the notary who certified the transaction will need to be examined. The title company will need to be contacted. The sale was filed, but the primary owner's signature, yours, is absent from the transfer documents. I said, what does that mean? She said, it means the sale is legally deficient. A property jointly held in your name and Ruth's and transferred to your name upon her death cannot be sold without your signature, period. She said, Michael appears to have convinced the notary that a document authorized him to act on your behalf. That document either does not exist or is fraudulent. I sat with that. The word fraudulent applied to my son. I said, what happens to Carol Patterson? Patricia said, she will recover her escrow and down payment. Her attorney will be in contact with the title insurance company. She will not lose money if we move correctly, I said. Make sure of that. Whatever else happens, she is not harmed by this. Patricia looked at me. She said, Arthur. I said, she saved for 8 years. She has 2 kids. She walked into someone else's mess, and she has been nothing but decent since I showed up. She doesn't pay for this, Patricia said. I'll make it a priority. I said, good. She said, I need to contact Michael. I said, let me call him first. Michael answered on the 3rd ring. He said, Dad, are you home? How was the... I said, I'm on the porch, Michael. A pause. I said, the porch of my house, where a woman named Carol Patterson is trying to figure out what to do with a moving truck full of furniture. The pause was longer this time. He said, Dad? I said, I'm going to let you talk. I'm going to listen, and I'm going to need you to tell me the truth. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, we thought you weren't coming back. I said, I had a heart attack. I didn't die. He said, the doctors said. I said, the doctors said I needed to manage my lifestyle and attend cardiac rehab. That is not a prognosis for someone who cannot live independently. He said, Dad, you're 74. You live alone. You could have another... I said, Michael. He stopped. I said, what did you tell the notary? Silence. I said, what document did you present to authorize the sale? He said, I found... There was a document from when Mom died. The estate paperwork. I thought there was a provision in it that... I said, there was not. He said, I said, Michael, stop. He stopped. I said, I need you to understand something. A woman named Carol Patterson saved for 8 years to buy a house for her family. She has 2 children. She believed she was purchasing a legally listed property. Because of what you did, she is sitting in my living room right now, surrounded by furniture she cannot unpack, waiting to find out if she has lost her down payment. He said, I didn't think... I said, no, you didn't. I said, my attorney is contacting the title company. The transaction will be unwound. Carol Patterson will be made whole. And you and I are going to have a conversation that I need several days to prepare for. He said, Dad, I'm sorry. I said, I know you are. I said, Michael. Why? He said, because... He stopped. The business. The loans. I thought the house would. It would have solved it. Everything. And I thought you weren't going to... He did not finish the sentence. I said, you thought I wasn't going to be coming home. He said, very quietly, yes. I sat on the porch in April, and I looked at the garden Ruth had planted, and I thought about 41 years of marriage, and the woman who had made this house into the thing it was, and the son we had raised in it, and the choices that financial fear and grief and poor judgment had produced. I said, go home to Emily. Take care of Emma. I'll call you in a few days. He said, Dad? I said, a few days, Michael. I hung up. Patricia came back to the porch. She said, I heard. I said, I know. She said, do you want to? I said, not tonight. Tonight I want to go inside my house, Patricia. I want to make sure Carol Patterson gets somewhere safe to sleep, and then I want to sit in the kitchen and have a cup of coffee." She said, "All right," she said. "For what it's worth, the missing signature is clear. This resolves in your favor legally. It's just going to take a few weeks." I said, "I know," she said. "He could face serious consequences." I said, "I know that too." She said, "What do you want to do about that?" I said, "I don't know yet. Let me sit with it." She said, "Take your time." I went inside my house. Carol Patterson was sitting in my kitchen. She had not unpacked anything except a kettle and 2 mugs, which she had found in a box marked kitchen, and which she had placed on my counter, with the specific practicality of someone who believes that difficult situations are better faced with something warm to drink. She looked up when I came in. She said, "I made tea. I hope that's—" "I found the kettle. Your kettle. I'm sorry. I said, "It's all right." I sat at the kitchen table. She set a mug in front of me. I said, "I'm sorry about this." She said, "You're sorry. Mr. Mason, you came home from the hospital to find people moving into your house. You don't have anything to apologize for." I said, "I'm sorry it happened to you." She sat across from me. She looked at the kitchen, the east-facing windows, the morning light that was now afternoon light, but that still had the quality Ruth had wanted. She said, "Did you really build this house?" I said, "Every wall." She said, "I could tell. When we were looking at it, it had a quality, like someone who knew what they were doing had made it, not just contractors following a plan." I said, "My wife had opinions." She smiled slightly. "She sounds like she knew what she wanted." I said, "She knew exactly what she wanted. She also knew what I was capable of building, which is more than I sometimes knew myself." She said, "I'm a second-grade teacher." I said, "I heard." She said, "I have 2 kids. Jake is 8. Lily is 6. I said, "Good names." She said, "I saved for 8 years for this house." I said, "My attorney told me." I want you to know, that is the priority. Whatever the legal process looks like, making sure you get your money back is the priority. She said, "Your attorney doesn't have to." I said, "Yes, she does. Because it's right. And because you didn't do anything wrong." She looked at her tea. She said, "Where will you go?" "Tonight, I mean, while the truck is still." I said, "I'm going to stay right here. The house is mine. The transaction hasn't completed. Legally, I'm told, I am entirely within my rights to be in my own kitchen." She said, "I should get the truck unloaded somewhere." I said, "There's a storage facility on Maple. I can give you the number." She said, "You're giving me the number of a storage facility in your own kitchen." I said, "It's a good facility. Climate-controlled. Ruth, my wife, stored her mother's furniture there for 2 years. Very reasonable rates." She looked at me. She said, "Mr. Mason, I want to ask you something." I said, "Ask." She said, "Are you going to be okay? I don't mean legally. I mean, you just came home from the hospital to this. Are you going to be okay?" I looked at this woman, 34 years old, sitting in my kitchen, who had been wronged by something she had nothing to do with, and who was asking about me. I said, "Carol, I built this kitchen facing east because my wife wanted morning light. I have been sitting at this table for 37 years. I am home." I said, "I'm going to be fine." She nodded. She said, "I'm going to get the truck taken to storage, and then I'm going to call my attorney." I said, "That sounds right." She stood up. At the door, she stopped. She said, "Mr. Mason, for what it's worth, whoever sells this house, eventually, whenever that is, and under whatever circumstances it happens, they should know what they're getting. It's a good house." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I mean it." She left. I sat in the east-facing kitchen. I drank the tea she had made. The afternoon light was good. Emma called 2 days later. Not Michael, not Emily. "Emma," she said. "Grandpa." I said, "Emma," she said, "are you home?" I said, "I am." She said, "Are you okay?" Dad said, "There was a problem with the house." I said, "There was a problem. It's being sorted out." She said, "Can I come on Saturday?" I said, "I would like nothing better." She said, "For the bench, we still have to stain it." I said, "We do." She said, "I've been worried about it." I said, "The bench is fine. It's in the workshop waiting." She said, "I've been worried about you." I said, "I know." She said, "Grandpa, what did Dad do?" I paused. She said, "I heard them talking, Mom and Dad. I didn't hear everything, but I heard enough to know it was about the house, and about you, and about, I know something happened." I said, "Emma, that's between your dad and me. I'm going to talk to him. We're going to work through it." She said, "But what he did was wrong." I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you angry?" I said, "I'm working on it." She said, "That's what you said about the tight corner on the rocking horse. That you were working on it, and then you figured it out." I said, "This is a little more complicated than a rocking horse corner." She said, "Yeah." She said, "Grandpa, the rocking horse is still perfect." I said, "I know, because we worked on the corner." She said, "Right." She understood what I meant. She came on Saturday. Michael dropped her off, which required a kind of courage from him that I recognized and chose not to comment on. He pulled into the driveway. He stayed in the car. Emma came up the path with the specific purposefulness of someone on an important errand. I met her at the door. She hugged me. Not the brief hug of a child performing greeting. The real one. Both arms, full weight, the way she had hugged me when she was 6 and had not yet developed the self-consciousness about it that children develop. I held on. We went to the workshop. The bench was there, where we had left it, waiting. She ran her hand across the surface. She said, "Still smooth." I said, "Wood doesn't forget." We stained the bench over 3 hours. It is not a fast process, staining wood properly. You do it with the grain. You let it absorb. You wipe the excess with a clean cloth. You evaluate and decide if it needs a second coat. It needed a second coat. While we waited for the first coat to dry, we sat on the workshop stools. She said, "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" I said, "Always." She said, "Why does Dad worry about money so much?" I said, "Because he has responsibilities. A business, a mortgage, a family. Those things require money, and when the money is uncertain, the worry is real." She said, "Did you ever worry about money?" I said, "Of course. When your dad was small, when the business was new, when your grandmother and I were building this house, there were months where the budget was very close." She said, "What did you do?" I said, "Worked, carefully, and talked to your grandmother about it, which helped more than the working, most of the time." She said, "Dad doesn't talk to Mum about it. Not really, he just gets quiet." I said, "I know." She said, "Is that why he did what he did?" I said, "It's part of why. Fear makes people do things they wouldn't do in a quieter moment. That's not an excuse, but it's an explanation." She said, "What's the difference?" I said, "An explanation tells you why something happened. An excuse tells you why it doesn't matter that it happened. What your father did matters, but understanding why he did it might help us figure out what comes next." She thought about this. She said, "Is what comes next hard?" I said, "Yes." She said, "But you're going to do it anyway." I said, "Yes." She said, "Because that's what you do." I said, "That's what I try to do." She said, "Me too." We did the second coat. The bench, when it was finished, was exactly what it should be. The wood had taken the stain evenly. The grain showed through. It was solid and even, and made with the right attention. Emma stood back and looked at it. She said, "Mom's going to love it." I said, "She will." She said, "Grandpa, will you come for Sunday dinner?" I said, "Soon, when I'm ready." She said, "Okay." She said, "The workshop will miss you when you're not here." I said, "Workshops don't miss people." She said, "This one does." Michael came alone on a Sunday afternoon. He had called the day before and asked if he could come. I said yes. He came at 2 o'clock, which is the Sunday afternoon hour I have always found conducive to honest conversations. Not the urgency of morning, not the tiredness of evening. I had coffee ready. We sat at the kitchen table. He looked at the east-facing windows. He said, "I always forgot this kitchen faces east." I said, "Your mother specified it." He said, "She had opinions about everything." I said, "She did. They were usually right." He said, "Yeah." We sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, I need to tell you what happened. All of it. Not the version where I explain it, so it sounds less bad. The actual version." I said, "All right." He said, "The business has been losing money for 2 years. Not a little, a lot. I have a line of credit that I can't service. The mortgage on our house is 3 months behind. I have been managing it wrong, which means I have been hiding it from Emily, from myself, from everyone." He said, "When you had the heart attack, the doctor said, he told me you might not return to independent living, not that you would die, that you might need more support than a single family home allows." I said, "That's not what he said." He said, "That's what I heard." I said, "You heard what you needed to hear." He said, "Yes, I think that's right." He said, "I had the estate papers from when Mom died. There was a document in there that I misread it, or I chose to misread it. There was a provision about estate management that I told the notary gave me authority to act in your absence." I said it didn't. He said, "I know that now. I knew it then, probably, if I had been thinking clearly." He said, "I found a buyer quickly, Carol Patterson, through a realtor. The sale price was below market because I wanted it to close fast. I was going to put some of it toward the business debt and put the rest in an account for you, for your care." I said, "Without telling me." He said, "Without telling you." I said, "Michael." He said, "I know." I said, "You sold the house I built with your mother." His jaw worked. He said, "Yes." I said, "The house where you grew up. The house where Emma made her first project in the workshop. The house where your mother sat in the window seat and read every night for 31 years. He said, "Yes." I said, "For money." He said, "Dad, I know how it sounds. It is how it sounds." He said, "I keep thinking about it. Since you called me from the porch, I keep thinking, what was I doing? What kind of person does that?" I said, "The kind who is desperate and made a bad decision." He said, "That's generous." I said, "It's accurate. I didn't say it was acceptable." He said, "What happens now? With the legal, with Patricia?" I said, "The transaction is being unwound. Carol Patterson's funds are being returned through the title insurance. The notary is facing a review by the state licensing board. Patricia is handling all of it." He said, "Am I going to be charged with something?" I said, "Patricia believes the notary bears the primary professional liability. What you did was, technically it was fraud, Michael, but the specific question of prosecution depends on factors I am not qualified to predict." He said, "Dad, do you want me to be charged?" I sat with that. It was a real question. I thought about the workshop, about Emma sanding a box over 3 Saturdays at age 7, about the rocking horse in her room, about Carol Patterson saving for 8 years, about Ruth's books on the window seat. I said, "I want you to face what you did. I want there to be accountability. What form that takes, I'm still working on." He said, "What can I do?" I said, "You can be honest with Emily, about the business, about all of it. The hiding has to stop." He said, "She knows now. Since all of this, she knows." I said, "How is she?" He said, "Angry, frightened. But she's not leaving." She said, "She's not leaving." I said, Good. He said, she's also furious with me about you. I said, that's appropriate. He said, she said the same thing. He looked at the coffee cup. He said, Dad, can I ask you something? I said, ask. He said, the house. Do you plan to stay? For the long term? I said, yes. He said, even after? I said, Michael, the heart attack was serious. I am managing it. The cardiac rehab is going well. My doctor is not recommending that I change my living situation. What he is recommending is that I stop lifting things over 10 pounds for another 3 weeks, which I am finding genuinely difficult, and that I take my medication, which I am doing. He said, I was scared. I said, I know. He said, I'm still scared. Of losing you. I said, I know that too. I said, Michael, the fear is real. What you did with it was wrong. Those two things are both true simultaneously. I am not going to pretend the fear doesn't make sense just because the action was wrong. He said, I don't deserve that. I said, no, but I'm your father. He said, what do I do? With the business? With everything. I said, you talk to someone who knows business restructuring. You talk to Emily, honestly, about every number. You stop managing it alone. He said, I've never been good at asking for help. I said, you get that from me. He said, is that supposed to make me feel better? I said, it's supposed to make you understand that it can change. I got better at it. Eventually, he said, how? I said, your mother stopped accepting my avoidance as an option. He looked at the east-facing windows. He said, yeah, that sounds like her. It has been 4 months. The legal process moved the way Patricia said it would. Carefully, thoroughly, not quickly. Carol Patterson's funds were returned in full through the title insurance process. She sent me a note, a handwritten one, on plain notepaper, that said simply, thank you for making it right. I hope you enjoy your kitchen. I put the note on the refrigerator. The notary's license was suspended, pending review by the state licensing board. Patricia handled this as a separate matter from any action against Michael. Regarding Michael, I am going to tell you what I decided, and why. Patricia laid out my options clearly. Pursuing criminal charges for fraud was possible. The document Michael had used to authorize the sale was, at best, a misrepresentation to the notary. A case could be made. I chose not to pursue it. Not because what he did was acceptable. It was not. Not because there were no consequences. There were. The landscaping business filed for Chapter 11 protection in May. The restructuring is ongoing. Michael is working with a business attorney and has, for the first time in 2 years, a clear and honest picture of what he owes and a realistic plan for addressing it. Emily is working with him on the finances. She told me, when she came to the house in June and sat in the kitchen and cried for about 20 minutes and then apologized for crying, that they are doing better, not fixed, but better, honest. I chose not to pursue criminal charges because Michael is my son, and because the consequences already arriving were real, and because Ruth would have asked me, not demanded, asked, in the way she asked things when she knew the answer she wanted. What I thought prosecution was actually for. I could hear her voice asking it. I chose not to pursue it. What I did pursue was something else. I asked Michael to come to the house once a week. Not for dinner, not for anything structured, just to come. We sit in the workshop mostly. He is not a woodworker. He never had the feel for it. But he helps, holds things while I clamp them, passes tools when I ask, sweeps up at the end. Emma comes on Saturdays. The two of them were here 2 weeks ago, simultaneously. Emma sanding something new at the workbench. Michael sitting on the second stool, helping hold a clamp in place. At one point Emma said, without looking up from what she was doing, "Dad, did you know that the wood grain tells you which direction to sand?" Michael said, "No, I didn't know that." She said, "Grandpa taught me." He said, "He taught me things too, just different ones." She said, "What things?" He said, That if you use the wrong tool for something, it takes twice as long. That measuring twice before cutting is not optional. And that if you build something wrong, it doesn't matter how good it looks on the outside. It will fail eventually. Emma considered this. She said, "That's about more than wood." Michael said, "Yeah, it is." She went back to sanding. He caught my eye across the workshop. I said nothing, neither did he. That was enough. Carol Patterson, as it turned out, found a house 3 streets over. She called me when she found it. I do not know how she got my number, which I choose to attribute to the general efficiency of people who teach second grade. She said, "Mr. Mason, I found a house, 3 streets from yours." I said, "I'm glad to hear it." She said, "It's not east-facing." I said, "You can always add a window." She said, "Can you?" I said, "It depends on the wall, but usually yes." She said, "Maybe I'll ask your advice sometime." I said, "Come by the workshop. I'll show you what to look for." She came on a Thursday afternoon. I showed her the workshop. She looked at everything the way Emma had looked at everything when she was 7, slowly, paying attention. She said, "Your granddaughter built some of this?" I said, "The birdhouse on the left, the bookshelf in the corner." She said, "She's good." I said, "She has good hands." She looked at the workbench. She said, "Mr. Mason, can I tell you something?" I said, "Carol, after everything, I think you can call me Arthur." She said, "Arthur, can I tell you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "When I came out of that house on the day you showed up, when I first saw you standing there with your hospital wristband and your plastic bag, I thought, this is going to be the worst day of my life." She said, "It was actually one of the better ones." I said, "Because of how it turned out." She said, "Because of how people handled it. You, your attorney, even the realtors. Eventually, everyone tried to do the right thing. I don't always see that." I said, "It's more common than it gets credit for." She said, "I think you're right." She bought the house 3 streets over. Her kids start at the local school in September. I sit in the workshop on Wednesday mornings. This is my practice now. Wednesday mornings, I come out here and I work on whatever needs working on. Currently, it is a small chest, pine, dovetail joints, which are the joints that require the most precision and the most patience, and which produce, when they are done right, a fit so clean and exact that the box needs no glue to hold. The joint holds itself. Ruth used to watch me make dovetail joints and say it was the most meditative thing she had ever witnessed. She said, "You become completely different when you're doing those, like everything else goes quiet." She was right. Everything goes quiet. I want to say something before I close. Not about the legal process, which resolved correctly. Not about Michael, who is doing the hard work of being accountable and is, slowly, finding his way back to someone I recognize. Not about Emma, who is 12 now and who made her first dovetail joint last Saturday, imperfectly and magnificently. I want to say something about the house. People ask me, people who have heard some version of this story, because these things get around. They ask me if I thought about selling it, after everything. If the experience of having it nearly taken made me want to be done with it. I tell them the truth. No, not for a single moment. The house is where Ruth wanted morning light in the kitchen. It is where Emma made her first box from pine, over 3 Saturdays, and stood back and said it had character. It is where Carol Patterson sat and made tea in a kitchen she thought was hers, and asked if I was going to be okay. It is where Michael sits now, on a workshop stool, learning, later than he should have, but learning, that the right tool for the right job is not a negotiable principle, that things built wrong will fail, that measuring twice before cutting is not optional. I built this house with the right tools. I built it with careful measurement. I built it for a woman who knew what she wanted, and for a life that has turned out to include things I did not plan for, and could not have predicted, and which have made it richer than the plan would have. The window seat still has Ruth's books on it. I sat there last Sunday morning with my coffee and the morning garden visible through the glass. The light was good. I thought about the promise I had made Ruth 41 years ago, that I would build her something that held. It held. It is holding. I am 74 years old. I had a heart attack in February, and I came home in April with a hospital wristband and a card my granddaughter made out of magazine letters and what I believe were intended to be illustrated saws. I sat on my porch. I drank the tea a stranger made in my kitchen, and I am still here. You do not leave what you have built. You stay with it. You repair what needs repairing. And on Wednesday mornings, when the light comes through the east-facing windows and everything goes quiet, you make the joints that hold themselves. I'll see you in the next one.